So nice to meet you all virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. And what I wanted to try and do today was a few things, and hopefully this will continue to work here. So I wanted to try and talk about a couple of things. I wanted to talk a little about this phenomenon of crowdfunding that we're all here to talk about, and why I think it is important and interesting from a researcher perspective. And then I want to give you two quick samples of some of the research that I've been doing in the field recently. One is with Jason Greenberg of NYU, which is about gender and crowdfunding, and the other is with Raman Ananda of Harvard on crowd decision making. And I think the goal there is less to sort of go in huge detail about what we have, and more to sort of give you a description of how I think this crowdfunding data can be useful for actually doing important, or well, I don't want to say important, but for doing strategic management research. So first, a little on the phenomenon. I know you guys have probably done a full range of introductions by now already, but at least my typography is that there are four major kinds of crowdfunding to think about. Peer-to-peer lending, sometimes considered crowdfunding. There's sort of this direct patronage or charity model where I give money to you to go to college or pay your medical bills. And then there's the two interesting kinds, equity crowdfunding and reward-based crowdfunding. Now, the advantage of being at SMS overseas, which I am not, is that there are more models of equity crowdfunding that are currently legal than we have in the United States. In the US, the rules are still in draft form, and it's not clear with the way that the rules are currently constructed that equity crowdfunding is actually going to be valuable in any way. So people are sort of routing around it. But it's going to be interesting to follow, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for really exciting research, because there is going to be something like 1,000 portals interested in entering equity crowdfunding. So there's going to be a chance to observe a lot of different new phenomenon kind of forming, and watching early stage platform competition. The research to date has almost all been done on reward-based crowdfunding platforms, however, though some of the work by people like Douglas Cummings have shown some connections between reward-based and equity. So the rules that we have from equity crowdfunding look a lot like the outcomes we got from reward-based crowdfunding. So reward-based crowdfunding is, Kickstarter and its friends, that there's a pretty significant amount of money being raised. And this is mostly what I'm going to talk about. This is mostly where the data work has been, though I know Alicia, who I saw earlier, is doing some work on equity and such as well. Okay, so few things that I think are worth knowing is stylized facts about crowdfunding. Again, this is a U.S. model, but we see sort of similar things in early international data as well, which is that crowdfunding is, surprisingly widespread. And this is interesting, right? Because what we're doing is changing the method by which people get access to capital. This chart here shows you through mid-2012 where crowdfunding funds are coming from and where they're going to, rather than this one. There's a few kind of interesting points here that I think are important to realize. I do this interactively, but I'm not sure how that would work exactly. But what you can see is, first of all, in the US, the usual suspects of like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco are large, which means they receive lots of funding. But you can also see a lot of obscure dots in areas that are not generally considered to be large-scale VC capitals. And there's also a bit of stereotypical regionalism going on, which I think is pretty exciting from trying to understand the geography of entrepreneurial activity and geography of funding. So I don't know if you could, I'm apparently sharing my screen, so maybe you could see my pointer here, I'm not sure. But it's hovering over a dot in the middle of the country that is almost entirely light purple, which is music. And for any of you who have ever been sort of Elvis or country music fans, that's Nashville, Tennessee, which is not an area that typically receives lots of funding, but because crowdfunding allows a sort of different form of distribution, you could see that country music receives its fair share of funding on these platforms. So there's some really interesting distributional pieces that I think need to be understood better. New York is more diverse than LA. LA is mostly film. San Francisco is highly tech-based. So some of the sets of stuff that you'd expect to see, the patterns sort of emerge here. And I've done a little bit of work in one of my papers looking at the Gini coefficients of where capital goes from compared to venture capital. And what you see is that actually by category, the Gini coefficients remain rather high. So money is concentrated in a few regions. But but across the board, capital is much more distributed. Another thing that I think is important from sort of a stylized fact perspective is that crowdfunding seems to actually lead to startups. So I've done some work with Venkat Kupaswamy of UNC. We've actually surveyed the population of successful projects in science and technology, design and games that raised over $5,000. So sort of the more significant sized raises. And what was interesting is a couple things. First of all, 90% of those projects turn into ongoing ventures, right? So even reward-based crowdfunding seems to lead to genuine, real startups as a result. And of those, over about a third reported yearly revenues over $100,000 a year. On average, they hired 2.1 employees. And this is, by the way, right truncated. So of the survey, we didn't get responses from the big hits of the early days of crowdfunding. So Oculus Rift didn't reply, and they sold for $2 billion to Facebook. Pebble Watch, which kicked off the wearables movement, didn't reply. So this is really just a right truncated view, and it shows that genuine businesses seem to be coming out of crowdfunding. The other part that's important to remember about this is that crowdfunding isn't just about the money. So if you look at the top reported reasons and the benefits of crowdfunding campaigns, which I showed a little graph here, and the paper's on SSRN, by the way, is after the crowd, if you want to look at the details of the data. But we found that the desire to raise money is actually the fourth biggest reason why people seek out crowdfunding. So crowdfunding is not just about raising capital. In fact, validating market demand, finding customers, building publicity were all considered to be more important. And if you look at crowdfunding and look at the data, it seems to be one of many steps by which people build businesses at this point. So people often raise additional venture capital or bank funds afterwards. So crowdfunding is this kind of interesting window into a very important stage in these companies' careers, but it's not necessarily substituting for all other forms of sort of typical venture finance. And then I think another important thing is that there can be a little bit of a tendency to get caught up in the funding aspect of crowdfunding and to view it as another source competing with VC or something similar. I think there's interesting debates to be had, and maybe you're having them about how comparable this is to other forms of financing. But regardless, crowdfunding does give us a window into something else which is important, which is the crowd itself. There are really important community aspects in crowdfunding. So if you sort of look at what has been successful in raising capital, it has tended to be things that have a built-in online community, and in some ways crowdfunding allows people to instantiate the sort of community desires through raising money this way. So among the examples of this, in before 2013, the end of 2013, when a couple celebrities raised money for films on crowdfunding, the biggest successful film project was actually a documentary about male fans of the children's TV show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. They call themselves bronies, for better or for worse. And this is a misunderstood community because apparently they like playing with, children's toys. And when somebody said, I want to make a documentary about you, and I'm sympathetic to you, they quickly raised over $300,000 and produced a documentary that you can actually watch on, and rent and everything at this point. So they found a built-in community with interest, and you found this in other places. 3D printing has found a home in crowdfunding. So I think the important thing to realize here is that the crowd actually matters here. We can't take the crowd out of crowdfunding. That dynamic of understanding demand and understanding what the crowd is interested in seems to matter a lot. Other data I have is that I think is just worth sharing is that crowdfunding is not high in fraud. So despite the fact that you'd think that this is a system built for fraud, that it's very easy to raise money. You don't necessarily have to produce anything in the end. You can claim it's a failure. Fraud rates were very low. Less than 1% of the money going to Kickstarter campaigns in the audits I did went to companies that were potentially fraudulent and that they seemed to have no desire to actually produce their end product. That being said, delays are very common. About 75% of projects are delayed, and the amount of delay that projects suffer from is strongly predicted by the size and overfunding the project. So the more delayed they are, the more likely they are to deliver late. So, again, another interesting dynamic that could use more study here, and lets us get some view into the phenomenon of sort of overconfidence in delivery. So why study crowdfunding? I think there's two reasons. And I think they're in tension with each other. And I think navigating that tension is going to be important to making sure that crowdfunding remains an important source of research in the future. So I kind of like to challenge the room as people who are interested in this topic to think about how do we kind of keep this tension alive. So the first reason is I think that crowdfunding is an important phenomenon in its own right. So when you study entrepreneurship, you have a whole bunch of nascent and potential entrepreneurs, and you have these important, meaningful outcomes of commercializing goods and services and creating new ventures. And we've had a whole bunch of pathways to entrepreneurship that have been important in both the literature and in reality that we study. So you can bootstrap a startup, you can raise risk capital, you can develop at a community level, sort of as accidental entrepreneurs, as in Tripsis and Shaw. And what I think crowdfunding does is add a couple of new approaches to thinking about how you can commercialize and how nascent potential entrepreneurs can create meaningful outcomes. So it allows purposeful sort of entrepreneurship to be raising capital in not in the accidental way, but I have a user innovation. I want to see if there's market demand for it. And there's this new concept that we haven't really explored very much, which is the community itself is driving product creation. So you're a group of interested people who like My Little Pony, you're a group of people who like 3D printing, you like virtual reality, and now you can actually create a way of bringing forward a company out of these sort of online interests. And I think there's something really powerful to understand about this beyond kind of crowdfunding itself. The second reason is the typical way that we treat new phenomenon, which is a laboratory for studying important aspects of firm formation or entrepreneurial finance or entrepreneurship. So here we have a case where there's large data sets that are easily available, where we could avoid left censoring because we can watch failed initial techniques as well as ones that are successful. Ones where we can observe online, and you may have seen some of the papers already, but there's been a lot of really interesting work on how communities, referrals work in crowdfunding. That there's clearly an economically meaningful component in that you have real success coming out of this, real money being raised, and that it gives us a chance to actually do experiments. So people partner with platforms and be able to use those platforms to do experimental work. So as a phenomenon, right, there's some power here too. So I have some worries about both of these things. I think that and I've been reviewing a lot of crowdfunding papers, maybe some from you guys, in which case I hope the comments have been useful and helpful. But I think one of the things that is important is trying to balance these things. So if it's just a phenomenon for study, then we lose what makes crowdfunding special. But if it is something where we're just viewing as a phenomenon, then it's a danger of being too niche. So I've been trying to sort of think about how to balance these two aspects. And I want to present really quickly the results of sort of two different research efforts with two different people, where I'm hoping to maintain the balance by looking at crowdfunding directly while still broadly making generalizable statements. And it's not an easy tension. I don't think I've necessarily hit it well myself, but I think it's worth trying to give a couple of examples. So the first is on crowd discrimination. It's with Jason Greenberg at NYU. And it's very much related to the work that Alicia Robb and others have been doing as well. So I think this discrimination issue is an interesting one. So it's based on the idea that there's lots of work that shows a bias against women raising capital, the sort of depressing numbers that far less than 5% of VC-backed firms have female founders. And despite the fact that women make up over 40% of the business owners in the United States, and that they're less likely to receive funds at all sources. And there's a lot of general debate that's not worth getting into right now about why this is the case and how much of this is discrimination versus other factors. But we decided to look at whether the crowd does better. And if you want to read the paper, it's called Leaning In or Leaning On online, so you can see more of this sort of theory building. But we looked at 1,250 randomly selected projects in 5 categories and the backers to find out. We frame this in the homophily literature, and that trying to differentiate between different forms of homophily. And the issue with trying to understand homophily, which is sort of like people like themselves, and is that there are 2 sort of levels of homophily operating. One of those is choice homophily. So the fact is that I, as a man, am predisposed to get along better with other men under this sort of homophily approach, and that over time, however, that choice homophily creates induced homophily. So because my networks are mostly male, that means that I tend to see less women. If I was a funder, I'd hear about less women in the network, and over time, my networks would grow to be exclusionary of people who weren't like me. So what this allows, crowdfunding allows us to do is move away from that induced homophily and understand when choice homophily operates for funding decisions. So we use crowdfunding as an approach. We, building off the work of Alicia and others, took the realized that different categories had different percentages on Kickstarter of women backers and women founders. So the dark yellow, if you can see on the graph, are the percentage of female founders. The light yellow bars are the percentage of female backers. And we coded the gender of all the people involved, and took the 250,000 project backers and analyzed from geography and for gender. And what we found was interesting, right? That women, and again, Alicia's has similar results, that women outperform men, in this case by 13%. But what was interesting was not that women outperform men, it was that women outperformed men disproportionately in categories where they were least represented. So technology, women did far better than men. And that sort of led to a question of why. Because under a homophily perspective, you would think that women would outperform men at areas where they are least represented, where they're most represented. So fashion, publishing, in this case was children's book publishing, that those would be the areas where we'd find the most success for women. So we thought about this, and we actually went and rethought about this issue and decided that what we're actually seeing here was a new form of homophily called activist choice homophily, where the reaction wasn't about self-liking, about homophily between individuals at an individual level. So I like someone because they look like me, but instead because somebody wanted to see a group do better. So I like you because you're representative of other men, and I believe it's important to support men, or obviously in this case for women supporting other women. And this is useful because there's a whole set of literature about when people act and when discrimination gets acted on. So there's a nice set of work about when do women actually help other women out, and it turns out that there needs to be some sense of a deficit for people to act. So that fits in nicely with the idea that you need to perceive this deficit and be an activist about it. in order to see sort of positive progress. So in this paper, we propose that activism moderates the propensity of women to support other female-led projects, and where we viewed activism as the degree to which women see other women as underrepresented in technology, and we ran an experiment where we showed the same set of projects to the technology project from crowdfunding and a fashion project from crowdfunding, and randomized whether you saw a male or a female creator of that project. So all the details were the same, except that in half the cases, these projects were ostensibly created by a man, half the time by a woman. I got to delve into a whole form of literature I didn't know existed, which was attractiveness research. So the two people you see at the bottom of the screen are exactly equally attractive, men and women. So scientifically determined by Princeton. We tried to kind of control for all those sets of factors. And what we found was, we used as a dependent variable the question about whether the project is a good idea, and we're doing some more studies now with some more detailed variables. We controlled for ethnicity and origin, previous crowdfunding experience, and we looked at and we defined activists as people who strongly agree with two statements asked post-evaluation, that I would prefer to support a project by someone who's underrepresented in the industry, and women are unfairly underrepresented in high technology industries. So they answered yes to both those questions. They were activists. We again are working on validating some more of these issues. And what we found was really interesting, which was so this is the results of a three-way interaction. So these are female backers, whether or not they consider a technology project a good idea. And what you find here is that the two left bars are the scales, the evaluations. The dotted line is essentially the mean. If you're not an activist on the far left bar, so I'm a woman, but I don't think it's important to support other women. I don't think they're underrepresented. Then you find the picture with the version of the project with a male picture to be a better project, and the one with the female picture to be a worse project. And that reverses if you're an activist. So if you're an activist, you think the quality of the project when it's created by a woman is better, and the quality of the project when created by a man is worse. Right? So you get this reversal effect going on. And that suggests that what we are, and the results are significant there, the differences are. So what that is telling us is that this sort of activism does seem to actually be occurring, and that what might explain some of the difference about why women outperform men in technology is that when you remove induced homophily and you move to this crowdfunding structure, it allows people to act in not just in accordance with backing the best project, but in order to act to sort of address wrongs or be activists. So different kinds of motivations, and that might be explaining why women do better than men in crowdfunding. So again, super fast overview of a paper, but it's sort of an attempt to kind of give a sense about how we can answer questions that are interesting and meaningful, and use crowdfunding as a background while still not abandoning the idea that crowdfunding itself is an important phenomenon worth studying. And I want to give one more quick example. I have a few more minutes, right?
Yep.
Okay. Second piece of research is with Raman Ananda of Harvard Business School. And we wanted to actually get a sense of how crowds were doing compared to experts. So as of 2012, more money now goes to the arts through Kickstarter than through the U.S. grant-making body for the arts, the National Endowment of the Arts. So Kickstarter is now a bigger funder of the arts than the U.S. government. And we wanted to find out what was being gained and what was being lost as we transitioned to the sort of crowd world. So we actually brought in 30 professional judges who had judged theater grants for the National Endowment of the Arts. We derived criteria from the National Endowment of the Arts about the criteria they judge projects on, artistic merit, feasibility of pitches, and we had them look at Kickstarter projects, and we selected them using stratified sampling. And then we took 120 Kickstarter projects that we gave them, 30 failures, or 60 failures, 30 successes, and 30 large successes. And we showed them the information about the project in a sort of more kind of isolated form. So in this case, we showed them who the project creator was. We let them saw the video, the number of project backers, the rewards being offered, and the project creator. Though we showed them the goal, but not the amount of money that was actually raised. So they didn't know whether it was a success or a failure. And what we found was interesting. So on the high level, we found that the crowds and experts generally agreed, and we didn't really have a strong prior on whether this would be the case. But 60% of the time, the crowds and experts agreed, and the more successful projects got more agreement. So the crowd may have been selecting based on any set of criteria. It could have been based on friendship. So the Agrawal Catalini and Company found sort of social networks were prevalent still online in crowdfunding. We found that in this case that it wasn't just about the people involved. We found, and so it does seem to be this difference between the two. And interestingly, 75% of the time when the crowd and experts disagreed, it was because the crowd wanted to fund something the experts wouldn't. So we found that this different selection regime actually increased the number of opportunities available. What was interesting then was looking at the off-diagonals, right? So we used a whole bunch of different criteria to decide when the crowd and when the experts agreed on something. So we asked the experts, would you fund this project? We asked them how much they'd fund the project for. We tried a whole bunch of different criteria. In a bunch of cases, we had 2 experts judging one project. We tried picking the highest score, the lowest score. So it was very robust to that. So no matter what selection technique you used, between 55% and 61% of the time, the crowd and experts agreed. And when there was a disagreement, the crowds would usually back about 75% more. And these differences seem to be stylistic. So projects that were funded by the crowd relative to experts were ones that were more crowdfunding friendly. So they had more rewards, they had more videos. So there's a technique in pitching the crowd, clearly. We also went to find out what happened to these projects in the longer term. So we actually surveyed and then and to avoid response biases, looked at those that didn't respond to the survey. And we found that in the projects that were funded by the expert in the crowd, that 12 of them could be considered successes in that they put on their particular play and it didn't end early. So very mild definition of success. And one was a commercial hit. So 100% success rate. Again, that just means the project was actually put on as planned. And 8% of those were very successful. In the cases where the crowd liked something but experts didn't, we found 10 successes, 2 commercial hits. So these were projects that performed a lot better, making money than anyone expected, and 2 what we would consider to be critical hits, where they won major theater awards, and 1 failure, which had one of my favorite reviews I read of all time, which was the New York Times wrote, upon leaving this play, I was thinking of anything good to say, and the programs were printed on nice cardstock, which I think is a pretty good indication that this was probably not the best play in the world. So that closed after a day. So 93% successful, 27% very successful. Now, these are not definitive answers. It's very hard to categorize these things. There's bias issues. But I think it's an indicator that what we might be seeing here is that the crowd, in sort of Stiglitz fashion, represents a different selection regime with a lower bar, and that may allow more variance through, which allows more success and more failures. So the crowd selection is not quite the same as experts, and it may actually allow more people to get more chances to succeed. And this idea that the crowd is not completely foolish matches other research that I've done, where I looked at signals of potential quality among projects. So whether or not there were endorsements of projects. So Time Magazine says this is terrific. Whether teams had experience, whether people showed prototypes, detailed plans. It turns out a spelling error decreases the chance of success for a project by 13%. That whether or not there were frequent updates to projects, all of those helped predict that projects would be successful in raising funds. So those are indicators that those are things that we found in the literature that professional investors look for, and crowdfunding, they all seem to predict success. I tried to think about some signals of quality, signals that indicated things other than quality. So I looked for things the internet likes and saw if those predicted success. So did mentioning bacon, did showing a cat video, was any of that more prone to success? The answer was no. It turns out that some in-group identity markers, so mentioning that you're a geek seems to help a bit, but most of them don't. And mentioning pop culture, Star Wars, Star Trek, generally not very helpful. So all of this sort of aligns to the sense that the crowd may indeed be kind of wise in making decisions relative to experts. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I think a couple things. I apologize for the whirlwind tour of 2 papers. Again, you can download those online if you'd like and look at them in more detail. And of course, feedback is appreciated. They're both sort of winding their way through various review processes. So always happy to hear comments on them. But I think my sort of plea to the room here is that crowdfunding could be both a phenomenon and a research setting. And I think that other areas like crowdfunding that have been studied tend to fall into either a phenomenon trap or a niche sort of business trap. So either they end up being used as phenomenon for research. So I think about entrepreneurship, and I think about, in general, it took a very long time for entrepreneurship research to be established in top journals as a topic worthy of study kind of in and of itself, rather than as something else to kind of test existing theories of firms and resources, etc. And I think we also want to avoid being a niche area, and something like looking at open source, where a lot of the work is on open source is about the phenomenon itself. But as a result, there's relatively little large-scale research literature that looks at open source in and of itself, that looks at open source in other contexts. So trying to kind of avoid pigeonholing crowdfunding as either just a phenomenon that we test other large-scale theories about firm strategy, or else making papers just about crowdfunding and trying to illuminate the topic itself. I believe it is possible to do wider scale research. I was trying to show a couple of attempts at that here. But I think that trying to balance that out, that we're all kind of custodians of this topic, and trying to do this in a way that is helps all of us out will be very useful. As well as being in places, I'm sorry, again, I can't be with you, to talk about data sources, share information and tips, and just try and make this, I think it's an important area, and to try and, preserve it as a useful thing to study in the academy. So that's it. I don't know if there's possible to take questions or you have time, but thank you for sort of sitting in remotely. Hopefully what I was saying was understandable as well. So thanks a lot.
If you can't hear them, I'll repeat it. Questions for Gita? Yes.
I had a question about the wisdom or madness paper. When measuring success, that was success of the stated goal of funding, correct?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard that. So the success, so remember there's 2 kinds of success here, right? So the success, or several kinds. So that we viewed success in this sense. Is this the slide you're talking about? Sorry, it should come up in a second. The longer term success issue. Is this the slide you're discussing?
Well, yeah. I guess maybe the one right before that.
Say again. Sorry.
The slide right before that, maybe. So
okay.
We talked about it as being
right.
Post. Yeah, there we go. So successful projects getting more agreement was, that definition of success.
Right. So there's 2 kinds of success here. We viewed the success of the project in this slide as it raised its goal, and we also had a separate category of exceeded its goal by more than 5%. So, overfunding and funding being success from the crowd perspective. From the judge perspective, we used a bunch of different criteria, right? So what score they assigned the project on quality levels, how much funding they gave it, did they give it 50%, 75%, 100%? Did the judges agree, right? But yeah, success here from the crowd perspective means they raised at least their amount. And in the paper, we separate out overfunding from just funding.
Yes.
I have questions with regard to the meeting or meeting out paper, and in particular, you have this very slide where it showed male and female non-activist, activist kind of breakdown. If you could go to that. Can you hear me?
I can't really hear. So,
Can you go to the slide with the male activist, female activist, non-activist slide with the bar chart?
yes.
Oh, yes, right, yes, is it better? Yes. Yes, this slide. So, this is really fascinating, and I really bought into the explanation, the theoretical background of how that works, being, a woman, and I kind of really see that non-activist and activist separation really drives things, and the outcome is very different. But how come you have like almost perfect symmetry between these four bars?
So would you mind repeating?
You have a symmetry between these four bars. So the outcome or the y-axis, there's a symmetry between male non-activists and then female activists, for example. These are the same rates, and the same for male activists, female non-activists. So I was just wondering why these rates are quite similar.
Yeah, so I heard that you were asking about the symmetry of, Alicia, would you mind repeating really quick that?
Yeah, no, she was just asking why you have such symmetry, but it's just really the raw data, that's what it's telling you, correct?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the result of what's essentially a four-way interaction, although we reduced it to a three-way interaction. So activism is a 2x2 times male-female picture, which is a 2x2, times technology fashion times project backer gender. So that was, if you look through all the interactions, the graph is just the easiest way to show it. The difference between the difference between activist and non-activist is significant. So the contrasts here are significant. It's less clear. So there's some errors here. So the symmetry is really nice. I'm not sure how well it'll be preserved in the long term. So we're seeing a concrete difference around all three dimensions or four dimensions, and this is sort of the attempt to graph it out. Yeah.
These are students who are in the experiment. It would be really interesting to look at this in a context of, people on a crowdfunding platform for equity or the debt, or non-students who are actually active contributors on these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, and we were actually, as part of the review process, thinking about some of the experiments to run. So I'm very happy to talk to anyone about any of this sort of stuff. I mean, the results were pretty, were pretty solid here. But it's, again, it is students evaluating projects that are already done and not putting their own money down. So all the usual qualifiers sort of apply here. The reason why, I mean, I wouldn't pin so much on this particular experiment if it didn't also align with what what we were finding in the category level work as well, in the actual field data. So the field data doesn't have the ability to kind of get into theorizing, but this helps explain some of the outcomes of what we've seen in the field.
Great. Any other questions? All right, we are off to our lunch break. Thank you very much for participating via Skype, and we're sorry you're not here to have some tapas and dinner with us on the beach, but we hope Philadelphia is not too hot or cold there.
It's just like Spain. It's amazing. If anyone would like to email me or continue this conversation, again, I'm really sorry that it's not more personal. I'd love to talk to anybody out there, so feel free to contact me if I can be helpful in any way.
Thank you.